Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the History Project's Out of the Archives series. My name is Tony Grima, and I serve on the board of the History Project and work on our events committee. In case anyone here is new to the History Project, welcome. We are Boston's LGBTQ community archives, and we're dedicated to documenting, preserving, and sharing Boston's LGBTQ history. If you're interested in queer history at all, please be sure to follow us on social media to learn about our upcoming events and activities. As you can imagine, we have a very busy June coming up. We will have tables at the Dyke March on June 7th and at Pride for the People on the 8th, and we'll be at the Longfellow House Pride event on the 30th. We're participating in several events with the Boston Public Library throughout the month, and we have a couple of book talks and other events in the works. So you can see how vitally important it is for you to follow us on social media to learn about all of these events and more. We're also very excited about our new community-generated history of marriage equality in Massachusetts. It's called Honey, Let's Get Married. Sorry, I did that wrong. Honey, Let's Get Married. And we've created an online forum where everyone is invited to share their wedding stories, photographs, invitations, vows, audio recordings, video recordings, documents, any other items. I dropped a link to the forum in the chat. And at that link, you can also check out what others have contributed. It's a lot of fun and it's ongoing. So please do check it out. My final plug before we get started is to thank you for your support and to ask for your help. As a community archives that is funded by the community, any donation to the History Project directly supports our mission to document, preserve, and share our history. Gifts of any size will help us do that. You can make a donation at historyproject.org. And now on to tonight's event. It's my pleasure to introduce you to tonight's panel. David Grundy is the author of Never by Itself Alone, Queer Poetry, Queer Communities in Boston and the Bay Area, 1944 to present. This is the first comprehensive history of post-war queer writing in Boston and San Francisco. David is currently a fellow at the Free University of Berlin, and we dropped a link to the book where you can purchase it in the chat as well. Julie Enszer is the editor of Sinister Wisdom, as well as a scholar, poet, and book reviewer. And Michael Bronski is a scholar, activist, award-winning author, and a great friend of the History Project. So welcome to you all, David, Julie, and Michael.
Thanks, Tony. So for today, I thought maybe we'd organize it around a few specific books, a few specific authors. So we'll talk about those, but I'll just begin by kind of very briefly introducing the book. So you should all be able to see a PowerPoint or some slides up on the screen. So just very briefly, the book, it's a book about poetry. It's a book about poetry and political community and the way that community relates to alternative publishing. So those three things: poetry, publishing, community. And one of the things I wanted to do with this book was to center poetry in the movement. So, you know, there's plenty of histories of the movement for gay liberation in the United States and in Boston and San Francisco, but with this one, I wanted poetry to be at the center of it, to show that it's not just peripheral to it, but it's really central. You know, you could argue that it was always poets who have led the way for queer people throughout history. They might be legendary or semi-legendary figures like Sappho or like Rumi, or you might have a poet like Walt Whitman, who is, you know, America's national poet, but also has this alternative vision of queer democracy. Or you might have the modernists, you have Hart Crane, you have Gertrude Stein. So when people are looking for a queer lineage, poetry is one place you can go to. You can trace it through literature. But at the same time, a lot of this is underground. So you can see on this slide here, this is some of the archival work that went into the book. This particular example, these are from the archives at Berkeley, and these are some material relating to the poet Stephen Jonas, who is a Boston poet. On the left-hand side of the screen, a roundup of starving artists gobble up rare books. This is a kind of, I guess, a scheme of like mail fraud, as it were, that landed Stephen Jonas in jail. And these are the poems that he wrote from jail. You can see the one on the middle is on toilet paper, and there's like a drawing of the jail cell on one side, then there's a poem on the other side. And then on the right-hand side, he's kind of written a poem on a roll of toilet paper. And these are just some of the examples of alternative methods of writing. Maybe this isn't even publishing. This is where you're in jail, so you can't publish a book, so you're writing on the toilet paper. So that's just an example of some of the things that I came across researching this. So we're not going to talk about the whole book. There's too much stuff. But the first part of the book kind of goes from the 40s to the 60s, and these groups of poets with links to earlier forms of gay and lesbian activism, sort of before Stonewall. So there's groups, the group that Jonas was part of, the so-called Occult School of Boston, the Berkeley Renaissance, and the Jack Spicer Circle over in San Francisco as well. And then in the second part of the book, we move forward to gay liberation and the gay liberation era, and this move towards a mass movement. So in the Bay Area, Judy Grant and Pat Parker are involved in solidarity actions for the Black Panther Party, along with lesbian feminism. And in Boston, we see the establishment of a radical gay anarchist collective, which many of you will be familiar with, called Fag Rag. And we can see the joint first issue there, Lavender Vision and Fag Rag. And there's also simultaneously an explosion of lesbian poetry, small press publishing, magazines, enterprises like the Women's Press Collective. You see an example there of an early publication, Lesbians Speak Out. And this is, why it's so great to have Michael and Julie here today, because, well, Michael was part of Fag Rag, and Julie is, I would say, the foremost scholar of lesbian small press publishing, and also someone who's continuing that tradition as well. So it's not just scholarship, it's kind of continuing with that in the present. So I wondered if, well, maybe I can bring you in now, Julie and Michael, and if you could maybe just talk us through some of these contexts, this kind of explosion of publishing activism and poetry that's happening in the post-Stonewall era, and how poetry relates to that.
Sure, Michael, do you want to start?
Julie, or I'm happy to start. So Fag Rag was an anarchist type. We weren't strictly anarchists, but we were anarchists, organized collective. It started with Lavender Vision, which had two issues, which was gay men and lesbians together. The lesbians wanted to put out their own magazine, and the gay men split off and put out Fag Rag. I came in Fag Rag 3 and stayed with it for most of the issues in one way or another. And out of Fag Rag came a publishing collective called Good Gay Poets, which we'll talk about many of the books later today, which were really some of the most formative books coming out in the early queer movement. There was one book, which we'll discuss later, we call Black and Queer by Adrian Stanford, which was, I believe, the first book by an openly queer Black man being published back then. But I think what was amazing about those times was that we did it, to say shoestring budget doesn't even get to how little money we had. We really cobbled together money to put together every issue and put out every book, right? But it really created a sense of community, not only in Boston, because we led over with Gay Community News and with other organizations. Stephanie Bird actually was a book from from Good Gay Poets, and she was involved with the gay queer youth support group from the Charles Street Meeting House. But it really was the basis, I think, for a national movement as well, since we distributed the books throughout the country. And Good Gay Poets also put out probably half and half gay male and lesbian poetry. Stephanie Bird, Ruth Weiss, the great beat poet, George Therese Dickinson, Pat Curis. So maybe Julie wants to talk a bit about the larger lesbian publishing scene.
Sure. Yeah, and I mean, I also want to say thanks to David for the occasion of this book. As I've been thinking about this conversation over the past few days, I really think one of the fascinating aspects of the book that I hadn't thought about until I read this book is the way that David makes the connections between Boston and San Francisco, and the way that those connections don't just emerge in the late 1960s and the early 1970s, but they are braided farther back. And so, of course, there was this really huge emergence that included the Women's Press Collective that did Lesbians Speak Out, and that beautiful first edition there, that happened in a variety of cities all across the United States, and not just big coastal cities, but local communities and other spaces where women were publishing poetry, publishing newspapers, newsletters, and really doing all manner of things to get the word out. I think one of the things that's really interesting about this connection between Boston and San Francisco is the way that a commitment to a radical queer politics that was aligned with an anti-carceral analysis. We're talking more about that in the past 10 years, but when I look at these historical materials, and some of this material that David already showed us, but also other things he talks about in his book. Paul Mariah, one of the publishers, really had a profound commitment to people who were in prison. And there's this clear linkage in both geographic locations about queer solidarity with people who were imprisoned, not only because people experienced imprisonment and being treated as criminals because of how being queer was viewed at that time, but also I think in a larger context of concern about how to make those radical linkages to reimagine a new and different kind of society. And the other two things that I think also distinguish the activism that was happening in Boston and San Francisco, not only this linkage to anti-carceral activism, but co-gender organizing that was happening. I think we tend to think about the 1970s and the 1980s as lesbians and gay men organizing separately, but a lot of this material documents that men and women were organizing together, and also that there were, if not multiracial organizations, examples of interracial organizing and commitment to really thinking about and addressing different racial ethnic issues.
Great. Yeah. I mean, I think what you say, Julie, about those linkages, yeah, that's really something I wanted to emphasize in the book. And I also wanted to bring the story of gay poetry and lesbian poetry together, because quite often they're sort of treated separately, partly because, you know, there were things like separatism and people organizing separately, not necessarily in an antagonistic way, but just because, you know, it's a political tactic that made sense. But the other thing is these connections, this emphasis on solidarity. So something that connects to kind of interest in abolitionism, maybe even now, but also anti-imperialism and kind of, you know, during the era of the Vietnam War. And then that's something that's kind of maintained and linked up to the fight for healthcare in the era of AIDS, for example, that someone like Pat Parker is talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would just chime in, Dave, and just say that the inspiration, certainly at Fag Rag, and I think for many other groups, was really the Black Panther Party and the Black Panther Party's list of 10 demands, what we want and what we believe, because then actually the Black Panthers really emphasized going out into the community, making community breakfasts, doing community clothing, having free clothing stores, right? The notion of a community that they set up was really emulated by many other queer groups across the country.
Yeah, and within this, poetry is considered a part of this as well, which you can draw a parallel to the Black Arts movement.
Yes.
And the way that people, whether the Panthers or other Black radical groups, poetry was really central to a political movement. And I think we can also see that with gay and lesbian poetry, it's not just that some people happen to be writing poems, but some of the main organizers or inspirational figures were poets, and that someone like Judy Grahn, for example, is providing like poems that are in a sense political theory for the movement. They're not just like something separate. They're where people are doing their thinking and they're organizing around as well. Maybe we can move on to our first example, which has already been mentioned briefly, but this is the Good Gay Poets book, Black and Queer. So this was published in 1977, I believe. And this is, as far as we know, the first book of poetry by an out gay African-American poet to be published in the States. Obviously, work by James Baldwin had been published earlier, but not in the field of poetry. So this book really is a milestone, but it's a milestone that has not often been talked about. And there's a lot we don't know about it. So Adrian Stanford was based in Philadelphia. He did some writing for gay papers, not so much, but there are a few things. There's something in The Advocate, I think. And I did a bit of digging, and it seems that his father was perhaps also a poet and a journalist who published in The Crisis. The magazine started off by Du Bois in the 30s. So Stanford's poetry starts appearing in the gay press in the 60s, in journals like One, and then in the 70s in Fag Rag. But he was murdered in Philadelphia in 1981 in circumstances we don't really know about. And so this book, quite a slim book, is basically his collected poetry. So there's a big variety of styles in the book. The title poem's this kind of political manifesto, Black and Queer. There's a lot of tributes to female figures. There's a tribute to Lena Horne, tribute to Tina Turner, and also to genderqueer figures, to use a term that maybe wouldn't have been used at the time. But for example, there's this poem for a Philadelphia drag queen called Sarah Vaughan, named after, of course, Sarah Vaughan, the singer, who is invoked in this really interesting poem, which uses this kind of classical register, kind of little flavor of Ovid about it, perhaps. So we're hopefully going to share a PDF of this book after the launch so people can read it for themselves. But I think for me, what's particularly interesting is that, this is a moment of assertion, a moment of pride, a kind of a milestone. But looking at it, we also have to think about the fragility of origins, because there's so much we still don't know about Adrian Stanford. There's obviously the fact that he passed away. His poetry is appearing at every stage of the development of the queer movement after the Second World War, but he's still almost this kind of invisible figure where there's all these gaps. In the anthology Brother to Brother, the anthology edited by Joseph Beam and Essex Hemphill, Stanford's poem opens that book, and Hemphill's introduction says, look, this is the beginning of Black gay poetry, but I didn't encounter it until after Adrian Stanford was murdered. And, and then of course, Hemphill himself passes away and Joseph Beam passes away as well. So we're seeing this kind of, this transmission, this lineage, this kind of queer lineage, but we're also seeing how fragile that is. And that's something that for me, the case of Adrian Stanford really like brings out. But maybe we could talk a bit more about this book. Michael, you were involved in publishing the book, and maybe you could talk a bit more about that experience. And Julie, I wonder if you had some thoughts about this question of kind of the fragility of the historical record, of this sense of, poets who are unknown, poets who slip under the radar, because you've done so much work of recovery with poets who might otherwise not be talked about today.
Right. I think it's important. This comes up in my classes all the time when students can't imagine a world before computers, right? I think people should realize that although Good Gay Poets published probably 10 to 12 really important books, they were really, laid out on people's kitchen tables or on the shaky tables of the gay community news office when it was at 22 Bromfield Street. I actually do not remember Adrian Stanford ever being in Boston. I think we did everything through the mails. And I think I would have remembered if he came here, since I was involved with shepherding most of the books through some portion of their production. I think our commitment was to have what we now say a diverse as audience as like possible, and Adrian Stanford had reached out to us, and we quickly took his book. And we'll talk more about Stephanie Bird later and her relationship with Good Gay Poets. But I think also I do have to say that David's done an incredible job providing the roots to his other work, because nobody else has ever done that. When I first met David and he interviewed me, I was fairly creeped out that he knew more about Fag Rag meetings than I even remembered through his research. So the book is deeply, deeply researched. But I think that that the Good Gay Poets Collective, which really was about 5 or 6 people, always sort of changing over time, was dedicated to the notion of a community, which we really that was sort of lost as gay publishing became more profitable. I think we probably printed up 250 copies of Black and Queer, maybe 300, because that was the budget. So I think that the notion, and I'll let Julie take it up here, the notion of fragility with these early publications is really important, because if Essex Hemphill didn't know this when it came out, it wasn't very well distributed, since I presume Essex read everything by Black gay men. Julie, do you want to talk a little bit about?
Sure. I mean, it's so great to see the PDF of this book and hear some of the history behind it. It's actually interesting. The distribution of poetry is the circulation and the distribution of poetry is relatively modest, even for poets that we know well and that we recognize. So it's great to hear you say, Michael, that you printed about 250 copies when Small Press Distribution, which was the major distributor of poetry, has recently gone into bankruptcy. And really, there's been a lot of talk in poetry communities today about books that will be lost. And one of the things that many poetry publishers talk about is that selling 120, 150, 200 copies of a poetry collection from an independent press is about what the circulation is for a good selling collection of poetry. So one of the things that I wanted to bring in is that how Good Gay Poets, how many copies they circulated is pretty comparable to what's being circulated today. It's relatively modest, but it has a big impact, because I think one of the ways that people connect with poetry, and we certainly see this in Judy Grahn, we see it in Steph Bird's poetry, Pat Parker's poetry, is people connect with poems and they share them with one another, right? So they're in a book, but also they're circulated hand to hand by people sharing it, saying, you need to know this, you need this information. And then the other thing that I would just add about poets who are unknown and slip under the radar, this is a real, this is a concern, and where we put scholarly literary attention, historical attention to really understanding different coteries of writers doing different work. Poetry is fundamentally a community conversation. Yes, it exists on the page, but it is also a conversation within a community of people about what they value, what they want to read about, learn about, think about, what they want to feel collectively together. And I think that some of our most significant queer poets are plugged into that community conversation, and recovering their work is also about recovering what was the community like that they lived in, what were the material realities of a circle of people that were often important and politically influential.
Yeah, I think it's also important to say that not only did Good Gay Poets publish books, but we actually had monthly readings, and sometimes we were the main group putting together a queer poetry reading for first night in Boston for New Year's Eve, right? And we had meetings, poetry readings at the Charles Street Meeting House, monthly, but also then special readings, and we'd actually bring people from out of town in to read as well. So it really was, and we had many open mic readings, I say, for better or worse for some nights, but very, very important for community voices. So it really was a community effort that, in fact, people partook in because it was really important to them.
Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, in a sense, when you're writing a book like this, you can write about these objects, these books, and that's what a lot of it has to be. But the work lives, like Julie said, in this community conversation, which is as much the readings and the socializing and the printing as well, right? Like Judy Grahn's autobiography is so good about like the physical fact of printing, learning to print from someone, traveling across the country with books, or like you're saying, Michael, assembling it on the kitchen table, like the famous press, kitchen table press, right, is named partly for that kind of ambience. It's not like a big multinational company making a book that is just like another economic unit. It's something that is being made by a community and coming out of a community and speaking to a community and building a community as well. Well, we've been talking about Stephanie Bird, and our next book is another Good Gay Poets book. This one comes out again in the 70s. And this is the wonderfully titled 25 Years of Malcontent. So Stephanie Bird is another queer African-American writer, and this is her first book. Julie is an expert on Stephanie Bird, having interviewed her. Michael, again, knew Stephanie Bird from the Boston context, from the gay community news, Fag Rag, Good Gay Poets context. So Stephanie Bird grew up in Kentucky. She described herself in her own words as a black redneck. She worked as a youth advocate for queer youth in Boston. And she was also involved with the Combahee River Collective, who are our final kind of point of call here. This book, 25 Years of Malcontent, it's quite a different book to the Adrian Stanford book. These are not easy poems. I don't mean that they're kind of obscure, but more in terms of kind of, they can be quite bleak poems. The first poem in the book seems to allude to a lynching. There are poems about gender violence and racial violence, but the poems can also be quite kind of assertive and defiant. She self-published her second book, and there's a poem in there which I really like called "I Many," which to me is like this kind of lesbian feminist variation on "Song of Myself" by Whitman, or kind of update of that. There's another poem which she called her drum beating poem called "Quarter of a Century," which is really great. And I think in both of those poems, you're seeing her talking about the self, but not in this kind of self-involved or closed way, within this kind of quite expansive historical framework. I think "Quarter of a Century," there's some parallels to a poem by Pat Parker, like "Movement in Black" as well. What I love about her work as well is that she refuses to sugarcoat descriptions of sexuality and these kind of romantic ideals. It's not a homogenous depiction of a lesbian community. It's like this quite kind of rough, raw, outspoken, trenchant, malcontent work. Yeah, and I love that description of herself as a malcontent. You know, like Aaron from Titus Andronicus, or you know, one of the other Shakespearean malcontents. That idea I think is really interesting. But yeah, maybe Julie and Michael, we could just talk a bit more about Bird, because this is a conversation we'd already kind of begun before the event started, so we can just continue with that.
Well, I think one of the things that that I found incredible in conversations with Bird before she died in 2015, is that she was a dedicated classicist. And one of the things that, you know, like you describe her as a Shakespearean malcontent, like Aaron and Titus Andronicus, she would have loved that. She was deeply committed to the study of the classics, to classical literature. That was a big part when I was talking to her of what she returned to. She was teaching composition at community college very nearly until her death. She was in Kirtland, Ohio, teaching, and then fell in love deeply with a wonderful woman named Pat, and she moved to Reading, Pennsylvania for the last couple of years of her life, and was lived with Pat. Was very involved in a Unitarian Universalist community, and I think truly joyful at that. Teaching was more challenging. She had a heavy teaching load, and she did not find her students at the time as interested in the studies of classical literature as she was. But she really dove into it, and that was an important part of shaping who she was as a poet. She was also, of course, deeply connected and influenced by lesbian feminist poetry, engaged with the work of Audre Lorde, Pat Parker, as you've said, also Sapphire, who many of us came to know through her novel Push, but was well known in lesbian feminist communities in advance of that. So, you know, those are just some of the things that I love about her poetry is the ways that she's in conversation with the contemporary lesbian feminist community, but also bringing into that conversation this classical past and really asserting that we are a part of that heritage, and we can take that heritage as a part of our community in a way that I find deeply meaningful. Michael, what can you tell us about publishing this book?
Well, it was interesting. So again, it probably had a print run. I probably have more copies than anybody else, and I have 3 copies, I think. It probably had a print run of 250 copies, maybe 300 again. My main memory of it is that, so I was part of, along with John Mitzel, along with Gloria Greenfeld, and I forget Pat's name, from
McGlown.
Yes, from Persephone Press, and David Peterson, of a small distribution company for New England called Stonewall Distributors. And we did Good Gay Poets books, we did Gay Community News, we did Fag Rag, we did some other smaller publications. And it was interesting that, and we had a bunch of bookstores to bring them to whenever we had product. But some bookstores had trouble with the cover and didn't want to carry the book because of the nudity. Right, and because of the chain on her hand, they thought it was just offensive. What was interesting, and I think my memory is correct, the larger bookstores like Reading International and Harvard Square had no trouble with that. Paperback Booksmith had no trouble. It was the radical bookstores like Red Book that had trouble with it because they were using a criteria of what was offensive that the larger stores were not using, but ignoring the fact that Stephanie had chosen the cover and that we were an openly queer press with actually lesbian members in it. But so that was the main thing. But my main memory of Stephanie, and I think this is important actually, is that she worked for a group called Lambda along with Larry Anderson and some other queer people. Larry Anderson, if people don't know, you can see him on the cover of Fag Rag 12, I think, if you look it up online. We would now say non-binary. Back then he did drag occasionally. Right, of a group called Lambda, which was, I believe, the first advocacy group for queer homeless youth in the country. That was in Boston. It was run out of the Charles Street Meeting House. So, and yet again, to go back to what Juliet said, right, was that in fact these are community efforts, right? These are actually speaking to the community and speaking to people in the community who are already disenfranchised. Right. I mean, I just want to say that I think it's Stonewall happens, Gay Liberation Front begins in New York in late June, in mid-July. By September, there are probably 350 GLF groups across the country, mostly on college campuses. Right. So it's once ADF started, it just took off, and out of all those groups came all the small presses. So it really is profoundly community-based.
And I want to mention that the photograph of Steph Bird there on the right, which I just love so much, was taken by Susan Fleischman, who's of course based in Boston. She worked for your CCTV for many years and also worked on GCN, right, Michael?
Yeah, GCN. And yeah. She actually didn't work for CCTV. She actually was CCTV. She conceptualized it. She managed it. She ran everything. Yes.
Yes.
And she has many photos in Gay Community News.
Yes, and she's an incredible photographer. I think, as you see in this photo, which I think really captures Bird in a powerful way. The other thing I wanted to add that I was reading from, that we had long conversations about, is she worked in Boston as a rat catcher, which was apparently a job that many people had. She had been unemployed, had been working occasionally in the 70s on different projects that were funded by CETA, the community. Oh, I cannot remember what that acronym stands for, but CETA was something that funded a lot. It was government money that people used to fund a lot of different radical feminist projects, queer projects, kind of kept people employed in doing community work, but ran out of CETA work and then was hired by the city as a rat catcher. And at first was really depressed, but then a friend said, this work has to be done. And in her reflections on that led to a lot of conversation about how do poets support themselves, and how do we do the work that's both serving the community, but also giving space to an inner life that can be explored through poetry and through community.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing to emphasize, is that a lot of these poets, the class background of these poets, some of these poets come from relatively well-off backgrounds, particularly like the Berkeley Renaissance poets. They're at Berkeley, but lots of the poets do not come from that kind of background. And for them, poetry is not this kind of elite thing that you do in your leisure time. It's actually something that's like important, that is like a part of your life, and that maybe you even have to fight to even get the space to write a poem at all. So it's like every poem that comes out is like a victory in a way.
Yeah, I think almost all of the good gay poets whom we published have working class backgrounds. I'm not sure about Ruth Weiss, but certainly everybody else. And Ruth Weiss was actually an immigrant from Germany during the Holocaust. So no matter what her economic situation was, she came from very hard times.
Yeah, so this is, poetry as part of community is also part of this as well, I think. It's a community that might not include people who would traditionally be allowed to be or thought of as poets. Actually, one thing I was wondering was who is the artist who did the cover? I realized I never asked this.
Yeah, I do not know. Julie, do you know?
I don't know off the top of my head. I'd have to, I assume it's credited in the book. I'd have to look it up.
I can see a signature, but so this is, I mean, this is also an example, I guess, of the thing we were saying about obscurity, right? Each little trace of a book or a publication has another story behind it. I'm sure if we went into this, there would be a whole story about the artist and a whole other context. But we should go forward to our final example. So this, as some of you might know, this is the Combahee River Collective, who I always think may be more famous than they are. I think of them as like, this really formative group who kind of shaped or who determined the shape of kind of feminism as we see it now. But I think even if their ideas have entered a mainstream, they're not always credited with the ideas. So I was very pleased to kind of bring Combahee into this as well. So they were founded in 1977 by Barbara Smith, Beverly Smith, sisters, and Demeter Frazier. They're named for the Combahee River Raid, led by Harriet Tubman, which freed an enormous amount of slaves. They began holding these private Black feminist retreats in the late 70s, and literature was important in these. These weren't literary retreats, but literature was part of these kind of political and personal discussions. Barbara Smith said, "You might find out more about matriarchy by looking at portrayals of Black family life in poetry and fiction than you would in surveying thousands of statistics." So that idea of poetry is a way of writing history as well, I like. But in the book, I focus on this campaign in 1979. In early 79, when a series of Black women were murdered in Roxbury and Dorchester, and there was this kind of deafening silence from the media and from the police, and Combahee were involved in this campaign, drawing attention to these murders, and they published a pamphlet called Six Black Women, Why Did They Die?, which will also be in the PDFs that we share afterwards, where they argue that the victims died because they were women just as surely as they died because they were Black. So this kind of intersection is very important for their analysis. And they reprint a new version of this pamphlet every time another person is killed. And the pamphlet contains kind of information, statistics, argument, but it also includes poetry. There's a poem by Ntozake Shonge called With No Immediate Cause. And Combahee also organized two big poetry readings in Boston, where Audre Lorde reads her newly written poem, Need, a Chorale for Black Women's Voices. And there's a kind of standing room only crowd. And this poem really kind of emerges from the campaign. It's Lorde's address to the campaign and to the broader issue of femicide and violence against women. And it ends with this slogan you can see on the slide there. we cannot live without our lives, which is a phrase that was borrowed from the activist Barbara Deming, and Barbara Deming borrowed it from Wuthering Heights. So there's a bit of literary history there as well. I think an example of the way that we were talking about Stephanie Bird and the classics, an example of the way that the past is always being used for the present as well, in ways that might be surprising, right? You wouldn't think of Wuthering Heights being used in that way. But this poem, again, talking about community, Lord intended it for use in Black community spaces to open up a dialogue about gender violence. So the poem is not just something you sit and read at home. You might do that, but it's got a call and response thing. It's designed to spark debate. And so we're seeing poetry intervening in a political campaign, but also beyond that campaign in a really specific way, I think. I should also mention there's also a poem by Stephanie Bird about the campaign called On Black Women Dying that also speaks to some of these issues. But yeah, maybe Julie and Michael, we could just talk a bit more about the importance of Combahee and kind of the role of poetry in their work.
Sure. I think I just want to echo what David was saying about that they're incredibly influential and not as famous as we might think they are. I actually teach this to my Power to the People class, and I've never ever had a student who have ever heard of the collective out of hundreds of students. Right. But I think I'd like to go back to the Wuthering Heights idea, right, and the connectiveness. I think that even though many of the people connected with Fag Rag, with Gay Community News, with Good Gay Poets, with the other offshoot we had called Boston Gay Review, all had working class roots. Most everybody had been to college and was actually fairly educated by those standards, right? So that it doesn't, that in fact the range of knowledges about world literature was fairly deep, right? And I think particularly, right, the people were very, very interested in Frantz Fanon. People were very interested in African literatures. And this comes out in a lot of Audre work, right? That it really was seen as a global enterprise, right? I mean, it's no accident, right, that the Gay Liberation Front took its name from the early incarnation of Women's Liberation Front, which actually took its name from the National Liberation Front in Vietnam, which essentially was connected to the National Liberation Front in Algeria. So people really saw themselves as part of a global struggle, and took that very seriously, right? Because of the war in Vietnam, because of then later on the bombing of Cambodia, which was an extension of Vietnam. So I think it's important to view particularly the collective's work as part of a global struggle, not only a struggle that started out in Boston and grew because of the literature. Julie?
Yeah, and I was going to say, I just wanted to also pick up this idea of the interracialism. I think that there are different strands sometimes where people talk about Combahee River Collective and the Black women who were killed in Boston as an exemplar of a particular type of racism in feminism in the city of Boston. And I think this is one of those examples when you dig more deeply, you see the way that the Combahee River Collective is mobilizing African-American women, certainly in Boston, but a broader community to address these concerns. And that broader community is interracial in much of its action, in the thought that it is drawing on. And I think there are ways that we sometimes struggle to see what that interracial activism looks like, what it looks like in solidarity, what it looks like in in the intellectual traditions that people are bringing and knitting together. And I think that's an important thing for us not to lose.
Right. I think it's also important to point out that even though today we think of Black lesbian feminism, or we think of all these great writers that Julie and I probably teach and people read, right, from Angela Davis on, right, as being determinative of this course of feminism, which is true, but not without a lot of struggle, right? I know that there were articles in Gay Community News from women in the collective really critical, attacking of Susan Brownmiller's book Against Our Wills, right? The first book, a first comprehensive analysis of rape in American culture, which is, alas, profoundly racist.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you take a look at it now, it is like shockingly, she actually blames Emmett Till. It's so bad.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that the putting up of the voices of third world women, and particularly African American women in like Boston, was in contradiction to a lot of essentially mainstream white feminism at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And really challenged it and really changed the course of how feminism played out. And feminism, particularly in, like, to use a tired phrase, a Ms. Magazine sort of feminism.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we're seeing, I guess, these books are also kind of interventions, right? So
yes, totally.
The campaign itself is an intervention, but the poem itself is an intervention as well. And maybe in a sense, the campaign is partly an intervention that is challenging certain aspects of white activism and working with other aspects. And Lord's poem is also similarly directed at an African American community, where it's challenging certain forms of anti-lesbian speech in certain circles. This, in your long and unfortunately unpublished interview with Stephanie Bird, Julie, where she was talking about encountering kind of homophobia
Mm-hmm.
within kind of Black activist circles as well. So Lord is sort of speaking across or to these different overlapping, or as we would say, intersecting elements. And poetry, I think, can be a really good place to do that as well, because you can have, it's called a chorale. You can have these multiple voices in it. You can dramatize dialogue. You can stage a dialogue. You can have more than one voice at once. Sometimes today, maybe we think of a poem as just, I speak in my own voice, and that's just one voice and just singular. But actually, what these poems are doing is always very dialogic, whether it's within the voice, like Stephanie Bird's I Many, or whether it's speaking to and with other people, and the audience will maybe respond or talk afterwards. There's this great anecdote about Pat Parker, where she's reading a poem, and then kind of halfway through, she's like, that line really doesn't work. Has anyone got any suggestions? And then she like rewrites the line in the middle of the reading. Obviously that's not going to happen in every reading, but that the way that poetry is responding to community is, I think that's an example of that.
And I think that Parker's poem Movement in Black, which I think gets written and women start performing it shortly after the wide circulation of Lord's Need. And that poem Movement in Black gets performed by different groups of women, all kind of chanting its recurrent chorus. I think all of those things are in conversation with one another, and how people are trying to imagine imagine different forms of activism, galvanize different forms of activism through poetry, and also use poetry to nurture people who are struggling with burnout in activism.
And these poems are in dialogue with each other as well, like you say. So Movement in Black, Need, maybe Quarter of a Century, and then also the work of Judy Grahn as well, which gives Pat Parker her form, and then that's in turn influencing Ntozake Shonge, who's then creating the Koro poem in New York, and that's creating its whole other thing. So you see this kind of alternative family tree, we could say. Maybe the family tree, but not in the traditional sense of a family necessarily, but an expanded queer sense of a family where all these different things are kind of creating offshoots.
Yeah, and actually Shange, first starts performing for colored girls in Oakland, California, in a lesbian bar there. And it's first published by the great Alta, who just passed away, who was doing Shameless Housey Press. So there's again this sort of transcontinental connections that these people are all living with.
Right. I think it's also, and we've been saying this in different ways all throughout the event, but that many of the small presses in the beginning, and certainly through a Fag Rag and other presses, that it actually was hard for people to publish poetry under their name because it was dangerous.
Yeah.
They had if they wanted to write a queer poem, even if they wanted to use the name, other places, even progressive magazines wouldn't print it. So at Fag Rag, right, we had a policy where we would accept, people would send us a lot of poetry, and our policy was to accept 2 poems from everybody, no matter what we thought of them, right? Because poetry was for the people. Poetry was not an academic discipline, right? Poetry, as much as we loved Elizabeth Bishop and we loved Walt Whitman and we loved Frank O'Hara, right? Poetry was not always for the academy, but it was for the people, and anybody who had essentially the nerve to send us poems should be acknowledged. And I'm sure that was true of many other small presses across the country, which Julie could probably speak to, whatever their official policies were.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, lots of the presses did not want to take the gatekeeping system on for themselves.
Yeah.
And they wanted to challenge what they saw as publishing gatekeeping. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's the other thing, is we've looked at individual books, but equally important is magazines and anthologies where you actually see the poetry in a collective context.
Mm-hmm.
An individual book is one person's book, but sometimes the best way to see a poem is in fact in conversation with 10 other poems on a double-page spread.
Yeah.
The 69 poets feature in Fag Rag, for example, where the title is also there's all this stuff. Or the many anthologies, like anthologies are such an important way of drawing things together. And maybe people are more likely to buy an anthology because it's like better value for money because you get more poets.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And certainly there's early poetry, certainly the male muse, son of the male muse for gay men, and the new lesbian poetry today, was that what it was called, by
Yeah,
Joan
just
Larkin?
lesbian poetry, Ellie Balkin.
By Ellie Balkin, yes. And then Joan
Joan Larkin.
I want to say Joan Nessel, but I mean Joan Larkin.
Yeah.
Did one later, right? Incredibly important. I mean, just incredibly important for featuring voices.
Mm-hmm.
So, folks, I could listen to this for much, much longer, and I think we could go for much longer. But I just want to be careful of people's time. It's about 7 o'clock. It's 7 o'clock now. But
David, also, it's 1 o'clock for David.
And it's 1 o'clock for David.
It is 1 a.m, yes.
But I want to give people, David, Julie, and Michael as well, a chance to, if you haven't touched on anything that you wanted to touch on tonight, but also if anyone has any questions, but also if people have to be somewhere, that's fine as well. So, yeah, so let's start with David and Michael and Julie. Is there anything that you wanted to touch on that you haven't touched on yet?
There is much that we could touch on,
yeah.
But I don't think we want to go on for another hour.
Yeah. I would say 2 things. I think that David's book is brilliant, and it does research that, again, I use that as a laugh line, right? But when David interviewed me, it was creepy because his research was so good. He knew things that I had totally forgotten about Fag Rag meetings. But also, I think, this material, and I for the past 15 years or so, or 20 years now, I've been teaching it, right? It's incredibly, not just inspiring. My students are completely and totally transformed by it, and think it's amazing this existed before their parents ever got married, or before their parents met, right? So I think that if anybody's interested, that there's tons of stuff out there to read, and people should pursue it. Julie?
I'll echo and say congratulations to David on the book, which is so wonderful. And I have a little quotation from Steph that struck me. This is from Stephanie Bird. She said in our interview, "Living is an ever-changing work of art. I have only to listen and write." And I thought that was very beautiful.
Very nice. Okay. So I wanted to let everyone know that we are planning, it was mentioned early in the event tonight, that we are planning to send out to everyone who's registered tonight a link to some PDFs of some of these materials. So that should be some good fun reading for everyone. And thank you all. Thank you, the three of you, for pulling that together, and Matisse as well for handling that. And let's see, I think that maybe we can wrap it up, unless there's somebody who has a quick question.
Quick question, yes, thank you. Where do you prefer we buy your book?
Good question.
Well, it'll be available from the publisher. I'm not quite sure how their distribution works. I will say that as an academic book, it will be very expensive, so I wouldn't blame people if they wanted to download a PDF that may or may not appear online somewhere at some point.
Well, I would add to that, urge your public library or university library or school library to purchase it, because they will pay the full price almost. And also it'll make it open to so many more people than if you buy it yourself.
Great, thank you.
Okay, that I think is a great place to leave it, but thank you, David and Michael and Julie. This was really fantastic. I cannot wait to read up a bit more, and I cannot wait to see your book, David. Congratulations. I know it's forthcoming, but still. And thank you all, everyone, for coming tonight. I hope we'll see people out and about in June and afterwards. And as I said earlier, please do sign up to follow us on social media, because we do have a lot of great events coming up. So thank you,
Tony.
Oh, sure.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you to the History Project.
Yes.
Absolutely. All right, have a good night, everyone.
Good night.